Today we welcome a global citizenship interview series, Yusef Waghid. Yusef Waghid is a distinguished professor of philosophy of education in the Department of Education Policy Studies at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He is a fellow of the Academy of Science of South Africa, a member of the International Network of Philosophers of Education, editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Higher Education, and principal editor of Citizenship, Teaching and Learning. Very welcome to distinguished Professor Yusef Waghid. It's a pleasure to be here and to welcome you to this interview series.
Thank you very much, Emiliano, and I'm happy to have this conversation with you.
So I'm very, very happy for two reasons. The first reason is that I read several of your publications and I'm always inspired by what you are writing, and that informed a lot of my research work on global citizenship, particularly with the reference to Africa. So that is one point that makes me very happy to have this conversation with you today. And the second point is that we really, really need perspectives from the global south, particularly in relation to discussion on global citizenship. So again, I really look forward to discussing with you some of the concepts related to global citizenship today.
Thank you.
So I'd like to begin our conversation with a straightforward question. And the question is, in your opinion, what is global citizenship and what is global citizenship education?
I will respond by giving you some background to who I am and why who I am connects with my thinking about global citizenship education. I was born in Cape Town, South Africa, more than 6 decades ago. So I don't entirely reveal my age, but I'm not secretive about it. And during my own upbringing and school years and school days and years, as well as university life, I happened to have found myself in a politico-social situation of exclusion. As you would know, that South Africa was an apartheid state, and it was only in 1994 that we had our newly established democratic government led by the famous Nelson Mandela, obviously. So my entire background for more than 3 decades was one characterized by oppression, repression, exclusion, marginalization. And therefore, it became important for me as an individual and part of the collective community of those excluded to announce myself. And hence my struggle began at school and university as an activist to make myself known and to make claims to what I thought was legitimately where I should have been and how I should have been considered. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that my understanding of education stems from who I am. And when we talk about education, we actually talk about not something different to what Aristotle has introduced to us, but we talk about a social practice of human participation and engagement. And when humans are obliged to participate and engage, they deliberate, they think through matters, they critique, they talk back, but they are included in that conversation. So education cannot manifest, cannot happen if there is no human engagement, if there is no interaction. And I happen to make those claims that if you say education ought to be democratic, then democracy should, or understandings of democracy should give you provide some of the rules as to how education ought to unfold. Similarly, if we talk about education in the sense used by prefix by global citizenship, then it means that the word globalism and the concept citizenship ought to inform what that education should be about. And my cryptic understanding of globalism would be the interconnectedness of all humans and post-humans, those where the human agent is not considered as central,
Right.
that those interconnections and even disconnections where there's not even connections and the complexities, that to me would be associated with what is global.
Yeah.
And citizenship is underscored by at least three dimensions. The one is there has to be an element of rights and obligations. There has to be an element of responsibility so that I can exert my sense of belonging.
Right.
I belong and therefore I act responsibly. And there has to be a sense of responsiveness. In other words, I cannot say that I'm a citizen if I don't respond, and in my case, to issues of social injustice, exclusion, inequality, whether it's environmental, socio-political injustices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those three dimensions of citizenship and its interconnectedness and disconnectedness, when education is underscored or driven by those elements, then we can talk about global citizenship education in a nutshell. So the idea of human interrelations, or I call it human encounters, when those human encounters are informed and guided by the global interconnectedness and disconnectedness with all its complexities, in order that one pronounces a sense of rights, obligations, responsibility, and responsiveness to inequalities, discrimination, stereotypes of all kinds, then one can begin to talk about global citizenship education.
Very interesting. And one of the elements that you mentioned just now is social justice. Why do you believe social justice is an important element? Of course it is, but within the context of our discussion on global citizenship.
When we talk about social justice, we talk about two terms. We talk about justice and we talk about society. How can you have a society that is sustainable, that is geared towards development, a society that ought to flourish, which we all strive to attain, if members in the society are not included, are not recognized for who they are, what they present, and if we do not engage with them in their otherness and what they stand for. So social justice is a project, or I would call it a discourse in the Foucauldian sense, whereby you have to strive earnestly for its towards opposing what works against any form of human flourishing or any form of cultivating humanity. If you cannot eradicate or undermine the injustices humans experience in relation to their society, to their environment, in relation to technology, in relation to who they are, then we would not be practicing education at all. The very idea of education hinges on the eradication, the opposition to discomforts that curtails human aspirations and human ideals.
Yeah, yeah,
And social injustice is that element
yeah.
which ought to be undermined.
Very interesting. And I think what you're saying here, in a way, ties with the next question that I like to ask you, because here we are starting now to sort of locate and contextualize what you just said in more broader and theoretical terms into your work as an educator in South Africa. And I think this is a very interesting discussion that we are going to have for our viewers. And so the question is, how global citizenship education relates to your journey as an educator in South Africa.
If you have to ask me what discourse I think summarizes or announces global citizenship education and what is central to it, there's a word that I've become accustomed to. It's called deliberative engagement. And deliberative engagement implies that you have to articulate yourself, but that is your exercise of your own liberty, your freedom to express yourself. And if conditions are not in place whereby humans can articulate themselves and other humans listening to you, in other words, there can be articulation, but if there's no listening, there's not very much. So articulation and listening then allows humans to take into scrutiny one another's claims, what one another argue for. And if you have that opportunity to critique, to talk back, you would have what I would call deliberative engagement. And deliberative engagement is what attracts me to the discourse of global citizenship education. Because you cannot say that you experience your rights if you do not have a right to expressing your points of view, if you do not have the freedom of speech. You cannot say that you can act responsibly to others if you don't recognize others. And equally, if others misrecognize you, there cannot be any form of citizenship if there's no mutual recognition. And more importantly, there can never be any sense of citizenship and citizenship education for that matter if humans do not internalize a responsiveness towards one another, that I need to consider what is important to me, not at the expense of you, and vice versa. So for me, those three elements would be what drives a deliberative engagement project, which to me is central to the work I would do in citizenship, global citizenship education. And it comes from my own history. When the policeman in the street, in the local community would confront me and ask, what's your point of protesting in the street? My response would be, knowing that I'm going to be abused, my response would be, it is because I want to be heard. And that's for me crucial to the notion of global citizenship education. Often we want to articulate ourselves, but if we do not have an audience that listens to us, then global citizenship education, for that matter, would never manifest in our practices.
Yeah, yeah. And this is very interesting. I want to be heard, and very interesting what you're saying here. I was curious to know, in the context of Stellenbosch University and South Africa more in general, of course, you have a long-standing experience in academia, and you've been traveling the world. Just before this video recording, you were sharing with me some of your traveling for research purposes, conferences, and so on. But I was curious to focus our conversation on this question that is a very straightforward question, but at the same time very telling. Why, in your opinion, GC matters in South Africa, based on the work you've been doing in Stellenbosch University and more in general in your country?
When we had the demise of the apartheid government and our institutions became democratized in a way, there was a reluctance to clearly, I wouldn't say there was a reluctance to embrace democracy, but there was a carefulness of academics in particular to situate themselves and to announce themselves. So they were kind of reserved and very, very careful in their expressions, because there was tremendous mistrust in the country.
Right.
So 2 or 3 decades ago, when there was so much mistrust in the country, despite the fact that we had a change in government, democratic education was considered new.
Right.
And with the newness of democratic education that had to manifest in our institutions, the reluctance of many academics were to be at the forefront or to announce themselves were very profound, because of suspicion, because of what they anticipate could have happened to them. Now, I think one of the aspects which attracted me to higher education, if I can speak personally, was to reconsider the notion of what it means to philosophize, what it means to do philosophy of education. And earlier I've mentioned to you in our casual conversation that it was important for me to prefix African to philosophy of education, and I'll tell you why. Because if you prefix African to philosophy of education, then you contextualize philosophy of education. Then you say it is no longer just an import from Europe or the US or Australasia, but you say it's a discourse that has a contextual relevance. So the people who's working with that discourse, even whether they live in the diaspora, they speak from a contextual perspective. Now, why is it important that philosophy of education is contextualized? Because when philosophy of education is contextualized, then you will begin to identify the problems, the major problems on your continent pertaining to that continent. So it's African philosophy of education. Firstly, you identify the major themes or problems related to that particular specific continent, and then you examine systematically, you may, the implications of those problems for education. And that's why I'm an ardent supporter and proponent of African philosophy of education. Like if I were to be in China, it would have been Chinese philosophy of education. Because once you begin to contextualize philosophy of education, then it acquires more meaning, and you will develop the passion and imagination, the moral imagination, to want to set things right. And that brings me to the second point I make. Philosophy of education, which informs my understanding of global citizenship education, has a context, has an agent, but it is also for a particular purpose. And that purpose is to ensure how we can make living on the continent and in the world far more sustainable than what it is.
Yeah, I think what you're saying here is so important, and I think in a way, he links with the discussion that I often find in the literature related to global citizenship, and how important it is that the notion of global citizenship is very much rooted in the local. In fact, some scholars, including myself, in some publications are talking about the global, so the relationship between the local and the global. And particularly when we're talking about perspectives from the global south, that um, just mentioning the importance of contextualizing within the very roots of the country the battles that people fought, including yourself, to have their voices heard. And I think this is a very, very interesting element that I think we should explore in the future and further discuss. And I think attached to this point, I want to ask you another question that is relating to the classroom setting in specific, and in more general terms, the university settings. How do you approach, or approach in the past, or you will approach in the future, global citizenship within your teachings at Stellenbosch University, in terms of relationship with students, for example, or more in general in terms of how you approach the curriculum?
And I would imagine that over more than 2 decades, I've been working at the same institution, that I have attempted to non-dichotomize teaching and learning. In other words, what I'm saying, I have never looked at teaching, university teaching, and university learning as separate. For me, teaching and learning are intertwined to the extent that we can talk about teaching slash learning or learning slash teaching.
Right.
Now, with this particular understanding in mind, one then immediately goes to the agents of teaching and learning. Now, let us talk about the teacher. So one then says that if teaching and learning are inseparable, then a teacher or a university teacher teaches and learns concurrently. And a university student learns and teaches concurrently.
Right.
Now, that's a powerful idea, because what it says is that in as much as a university teacher educates, so that university teacher is also educated by her students.
Yes, that's right.
Similarly, in as much as a university educator learns, so a student also learns from their engagement with their teacher.
Right.
So there's a mutual interrelationship between teaching and learning, and hence I do not separate the two. So the question is, what does global citizenship education do to teachers? It gives teachers the authority to provoke students. So what does it mean? It means that when a student is provoked, then the student is, in the sense used by Jacques Rancière, then a student is summoned to speak her mind. And that, to me, is provocation in teaching. That teachers have to summon students to speak their minds. And that is what I've been attempting to do in my own university classrooms. Similarly, when students have been provoked, you have actually evoked their potentialities. So they experience a sense of evocation. You did the provocation as a teacher, and they experience the evocation, meaning that they recognize their potential as students to learn and then to teach in return. Now, for me, that could only have happened with a particular understanding of global citizenship education where the practice of deliberative engagement, as I've mentioned previously, has been central. When people are afforded an opportunity to speak their minds, to be listened to, and then to talk back.
Right, right. I think what you're saying here is very important, at the same time very interesting. Sort of a important mission that is embodied by the teacher when he or she teaches about global citizenship is exactly that, a sort of awakening the critical consciousness and the will also to take actions of their students, something that happens when we're talking about educating for global citizenship. And in relation to this, we are heading here toward the end of our very, very interesting and informative conversation. I want to ask you a very straightforward and at the same time very challenging question. And don't worry, because all the guests go through this, and I know you're not worried, but it can be challenging. The question is, how would you um, uh, how would you explain with our viewers three core elements of global citizenship education, and why you choose these three elements? In other words, what are three core elements of global citizenship education in your opinion?
Okay, let me start by saying that global citizenship education has to engender or cultivate a sense of sudden upheaval or ruptures, to use Foucault again. If global citizenship education cannot cause sudden upheavals of thought and ruptures, then that is not global citizenship education at all. In other words, humans, those who engage in global citizenship education, has to feel uncomfortable, must recognize the opportunity to critique, and must be able to see things in a skeptical way. Now, if those things were to happen, there's only three things that I would accentuate as important to remember. For me, it's deliberation. If there's no deliberative engagement, there's no talking, there's no listening, and there's no talking back. If there's no deliberation, you can't talk about global citizenship education. Secondly, global citizenship education has to be a matter of res- acting responsibly, that you recognize yourself as an agent in the process, but you also recognize the presence of others. And equally, others have to recognize your presence. So you might be locally situated, correct? But those of others who might be somewhere, but they are not nowhere, they are somewhere. They might be strange, but they are not really estranged or far away from you. They have to recognize you equally, and they have to act responsibly towards you as well. So for me, responsibility is a second element of global citizenship education. And thirdly, responsiveness. If we cannot get anywhere with global citizenship education, if global citizenship education cannot result in social justice, environmental justice, technological justice, and more significantly, democratic justice, we cannot talk about global citizenship education, because it has to have a purpose. And it doesn't mean that, for example, democratic justice can be attained. To use one of my favorite theoreticians, Giorgio Agamben, he would argue, if you say something has already been actualized, it's no longer there. And by the way, as I've mentioned, Agamben is Italian. If you say
Yes.
something is actualized, then it can no longer be. because then you are preventing that something from further evolving into something else. So rather talk about global citizenship education and the responsiveness as in becoming, that there's no conclusion about it, that there's no finality. It's like education. The
Right.
sooner we, the sooner we say that education is now complete, we have actually destroyed the very purpose of what education stands for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Education, like global citizenship education, is an incomplete project. There is no finality about it. It's always in becoming.
Yeah.
But there are new moments and new imaginings that would be relevant to the times of the day.
Mm.
So my three words would be deliberation, responsibility, and responsiveness.
Very interesting. And how do you foresee changes in education after the global pandemic of COVID-19? What changes do you foresee in general? I'm curious to know your opinion because you are a proper philosopher of education. So,
I would imagine that the euphoria we had about being in a physical classroom and learn, that euphoria would no longer be there.
yeah.
Because what COVID-19 has taught us is that we can learn virtually as well. And
Yeah.
that we can learn, that we really only learn through engagement. So it doesn't matter if we are in a class virtually or physically. So what COVID-19 has said, shift the focus away from our physical presences. I don't have to have lived with Aristotle in order to make sense of what he has said. I can live with him as I engage with his texts. And that can be now virtually. I've never met him, but I internalize his thoughts and it becomes part of me. And when it becomes part of me, then I develop, as Maxine Green, one of my favorite philosophers of education, would say, when you begin to see things anew and you imagine alternative possibilities for things, then only you have learned. And I think COVID-19, the pandemic, has made it possible for us to develop analysis, more reflective thoughts, because we have more time to do deeper thinking and critical analyses. And for that, I'm grateful. So I'm not pessimistic about the ramifications of COVID-19 because for philosophers of education, there was an opportunity for deeper reflective moments.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. In fact, exactly what you're saying, the opportunities to engage with colleagues, people around the world, at least on my side, and I believe on your side as well, increased exponentially. And it's very, very interesting phenomena and exactly matches what you're saying right now. And one last question. Is there any author, any philosopher, anyone you like to share with our viewers that particularly interests you at the moment, you particularly reading recently? I think I should start asking this question more frequently because we discover new scholars, new educators by asking this question. So I was curious to ask you this question.
I um, have been influenced recently over the last decade by Giorgio Agamben, who's in fact Italian, a Renaissance, known as a Renaissance scholar. And most of his books, in particular the one on community, has been very, very insightful. In fact, it shaped my thinking about global citizenship education. And then the post-humanist scholar, also Italian, but I think teaches now in the UK, Luciana Parisi. Her work on education education and technology is also inspirational. So, philosopher, I would say Giorgio Agamben. Um, I'm not misrecognizing important philosophers of education, but I think what Agamben at least does is to look at Aristotle differently. And then that has been those who have been very influential in my own thinking has been, and he's still Jacques Rancière, French philosopher, and of course the famous Jacques Derrida. And for pedagogy, it was Maxine Green. Her book, Releasing the Imaginations, published by Joseph Bass in 1995, is just a monumental piece of writing.
Very interesting. Very
Releasing the
interesting.
Imagination. So those would be important scholars' work that I would invariably draw on to develop my thoughts, even on global citizenship education.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, we need a sort of a dynamism in refreshing constantly the meaning, discussing and rediscussing the meaning of global citizenship, because it's a really complex and even super complex concept that needs a constant discussion. And our discussion today was very, very, very interesting. I really enjoyed speaking with you. So we really thank you, distinguished Professor Yusef Waghid, for being with us and joining the GCE interview series. And I'm confident that our viewers will really, really enjoy your thoughts.
Thank you, Emiliano. And it's been my privilege to have engaged with you. And I'm looking forward to more similar projects with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to mention that you have written a wonderful chapter within my recent book for Routledge, Conversations on Global Citizenship Education, which, by the way, really links with what you were saying about deliberative conversation, because this is a book that is sort of new to the field, because it's based on conversations with senior scholars based worldwide on discussion about what is global citizenship. And of course, you contributed with a chapter discussing your experience in South Africa, Stellenbosch University, and your understanding of global citizenship. And so, having said that, I really look forward to further engaging with you in future projects. And again, thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for allowing me the pedagogical space to engage. But we will be in touch.
Absolutely.